actually, I'm going to go back and do a talk I did 3 years ago with a few changes because of Ben's talk. Remember, you don't remember, but 3 years ago, back in 2016, I did 5 talks on perennial wisdom. So many of you remember me using that term, perennial wisdom. The second talk I did on perennial wisdom was entitled, Who Are You? And that was critical to the other talks that were coming up. But in the talk, Who Are You? I suggested that you are nobody. In the sense that your essence is not to be identified with any human form category like personality, gender, religion, ethnicity, age, weight, and so forth and so on. That no-thingness is your true self that always remains regardless of what your personality may be doing, feeling, or thinking. Okay? Even though we cannot really name that part of ourselves or describe it, it is more truly your me than anything else that your ego can imagine about yourself. We began as this seemingly separate form. Merton calls it the false self. We began, and in time, along the way, maybe during some contemplative experience, some contemplative practice, some all-filled experience in nature, that form dissolves. And we discover for a moment that form, which we thought comprises us, is not there at all. And that which really comprises us is the same reality that comprises everything else. Or as Merton says, we're all one already. As the false self, God seems other than us, but through spiritual practice or an all-filled awakening, we discover there is no other. There's only the divine, manifesting as us and everything. I submit that's who we are. Now, the third talk on perennial wisdom I did, the question was, where did I come from? You either came from somewhere else, or you came from here. You're either an alien to this world, or you belong. Perennial wisdom is that you didn't come from somewhere else. You grew out of this world right here. You were a total natural expression of 13.8 billion years of loving evolutionary creativity. You and I are one of the ways that the ground of being is manifesting itself in this universe. Now today, because of Ben's talk primarily, I'm going to respond to the question, where am I going? The topic here is death. Where are you going when you die? When this particular form dissolves. Now, if you've been listening up to this point, you already know the answer. if you answered the previous question, who am I and where did I come from, by saying, well, I'm somebody with personality, gender, ethnicity, age, weight, and so forth, who came from somewhere other than here, or I have this eternal part of me called the soul, then I'm going somewhere other than here when I die. Or my eternal soul is going somewhere else. Okay? That would be one stance to take. But if you're really nobody who emerged from the rise and fall of the natural process of creation, then there's nowhere to go and no one to go there. Are you following that? Most people who believe they are somebody, or that they have this eternal separate soul, also believe that they are somebody other and separate from all the other somebodies in the universe, and unfortunately separate from the somebody that created all of these somebodies. The somebody they believe themselves to be isn't the physical body, but a separate spirit body, call it the soul if you like, who lives on after the body dies. However, this soul may differ from the physical you, it's still you. And its fate is tied to how you acted and what you believed while you were living in this body here and now. That's what we were all taught in Sunday school as children. Okay? What's going to happen to you after you die is tied to the way you lived your life here and what you believed here. This is the notion that you exist separate from the whole, and that the you that really matters is the finite you of the personality. Similarly with reincarnation, people talk about my past lives or my future lives as if there is an I that lives over and over again. Both scenarios, heaven and hell, and reincarnation, are far too egoic for me. There is no evidence that the ego transcends the body and continues to exist as a separate ego in some form or another, nor does that fit with the experience of the mystics of every generation who continue to report a complete dissolution of ego awareness into a vast oneness with all of reality. Of course, as Ben talked about last month, there are the near-death experiences of people, and people who supposedly remember past lives. Now, I don't want to dismiss people's near-death experiences or past life recognition, but what do they mean? What is the activity of the brain that produces these experiences? We do not know. As a therapist, I used hypnosis with clients to get them to have the experience of floating above their body. And I used it to help them remember possible past lives. Those those were important therapeutic techniques for various reasons. But I think, now, I don't know, but I think the near-death experience is just that, near death, and not actual death itself. No one has actually died and stayed dead for days and then returned to life. The classic near-death encounter with the light has been urged us to go into the light, and the experience with past loved ones is decidedly egocentric, and that's to be expected. Here there's no loss of the sense of self. Therefore, the experience may not be really complete. If death is permanent and we do not return, I believe our self is stripped of the elements of ego selfhood, and we simply merge with the light that we've been seeking. Our security and consolation isn't to cling to the ego all that more strongly, but it's to begin to loosen our grasp and to see if there's something more to us than meets the eye. Now you remember the analogy that you and I are waves on the great ocean of God, and even though we come into being from universal consciousness, whatever that means, and are waving for a time on the great ocean of God, in our essence, we're always water. And eventually, the wave will not exist and will fall back into the ocean from which we came. If you toss a seemingly separate ice cube into a bowl of water, over time the ice will melt and it will simply merge with the water in the bowl. The ice cube loses its form, but not its essence. Its essence is H2O, not other than that of the water in the bowl. Its initial shape, like we are here, as a cube, is allowed to stand out from the rest of the water in the bowl for a time, but eventually it will be no more. But it won't be less than it was before it became a cube. Now that's hard to comprehend rationally. You remember the rope analogy that I used once before, that we're all knots on the rope of God. So maybe you remember that. I used my father knot that got tied in 1906, and then I used my Joe knot that got tied in 1940. And then you could do this with your family. Just tie all the knots on the rope of God. These were who you are. Okay? Now they're not different from the rope. Okay? When you compare the two knots, though, it's clear that each knot has its own uniqueness, its own place on the rope, its own degree of tightness, its own shape, and both knots are not other than the single strand of rope. All right? And then my father knot got untied after it had been there 94 years, and it's gone. But guess what still exists? A rope still exists. Okay? Where did the knot go when it was untied? How can it be that the rope is still there while the knot is not? Let's say the rope is eternal, if you like, and knots come and go.
Yep.
To the extent that you identify with a knot, oh, there I am, and I'm identifying pretty heavily with it. The untying of a knot, either for you or for those that love you, will be experienced as a loss, and they will grieve the loss of the knot. But what's really lost? Huh? Only the form is lost. The rope is God, the whole of reality. Knots are people, animals, plants, stars, galaxies, black holes, dark matter. Indeed, everything that comprises the universe, both seen and unseen. Coming into being through birth is the tying of knots. Death is the untying of knots. You and I are a knot on the eternal rope of God. So my father knot is gone, but my father rope is still here. I miss my father knot. And you miss those knots of those you've loved that are gone. But the rope is still here. My connection to him is still there because we're both of the same rope. So where do you go when you die?
Nowhere.
What I'm saying is, there's no real you separate from the rope to come from somewhere and to go to somewhere. There's no after rope fate, like heaven or hell, that can befall the untied knot, because the knot doesn't exist separate from the rope. All there is rope, my friends. All there is the ground of beingness. Everyone longs to know what happens after death, because everyone wants the security of believing that something happens after death. But what happens to the rope when the knot is untied? What happens to the ocean when the wave returns? Of course, this way of understanding is anathema to our ego self, so desirous of eternal life as itself. The ego insists on some personal immortality and clings to this notion desperately. There's no escape from death when the you is the ego self. There's no death at all when the you is the divine self. Thich Nhat Hanh, in his book, No Death, No Fear, says that we all live in two dimensions, the historical dimension and the ultimate dimension of reality. He says we can deeply touch one and we can deeply touch the other. We have a historical dimension which we live every day, and we have an ultimate dimension with which we can try to live using our spiritual practice. If we can live in the ultimate dimension at the same time as we function in the historical, we will have no more fear. if we can live in the ultimate dimension at the same time that we function in this historical dimension, we will have no more fear. He says a wave has a right to live her life as a wave. But she must also live her life as water, because she is not only a wave, she is also water. The water lives without fear that's carried by the wave. If you do this practice, he says, one day you will touch your true nature of no birth and no death. You can then become someone, he says, who rides majestically on the waves of birth and death, because you're no longer agitated by fear or anxiety. End of quote. What I want you to know is the egoic you is, in this historical dimension, is precious, real, unique, and temporary. It's a manifestation of a singular reality. Call it God, Tao, Allah, universal consciousness, whatever. And it tends to forget and imagines itself to be apart from God rather than a part of God. When the Indian sage Maharisha was dying, his students crowded around him, begging him not to go. His response was pure perennial wisdom. He said, "Why, where could I go?" The aim of spiritual practice is to awaken us to who we really are. And then, when we do, we may discover the answer to the question, where am I going? Nowhere. Again, none of this can be proved. And you do not have to believe anything I'm saying. Either way, I want all of us to touch this precious historical dimension. Our notness, our waveness, and at the same time, to touch our ultimate dimension, our ropeness, our water, without fear or anxiety.